Good evening. How's everybody? Woo! My name is Franklin Sermons. I am the director of the Pérez Art Museum Miami. It's been 7 days and I'm still trying to work it out, so bear with me. I am ecstatic that I have the opportunity to do this first public introduction this evening. And I just want to say it's good to see so many friendly faces and coming in and going, and I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad to be here, and just thankful for the warm welcome. So that being said, we have this incredible public program tonight, and I could not be happier to have to introduce these two gentlemen. First, I have to thank Deborah and Dennis Scholl for making this lecture series possible. And I want to say thanks to Mari Robles, our Deputy Director for Education and Programs, who has coordinated tonight. And I have to point out this is in the Project Gallery, Jeff Wall's exhibition in the Project Gallery, and part of that ongoing series. And thank you for Bank of America, as well as the Knight Foundation for supporting the series. I'm going to go a little bit off script for a minute. I guess I want to also say something about Tobias, and I'm honored to be here working with you, and the fact that this exhibition exists, of course, goes back to you guys' relationship, and Tobias bringing this exhibition here. I mean, amongst many, I just had the pleasure to come in the last week of Poetics of Relation, and to have experienced the Beatriz Milaches show, and others here, so many. It feels like, I think, even in the course of just the last couple of years, more than like 30 exhibitions and projects, and it is an honor to be able to work with you and your team. And Tobias has conceived of I think, the sort of an innovative curatorial strategy for the museum, but also for this building, and really for thinking through sort of curatorial strategies in the present, and taking into account many things. And additionally, I mean, coming here from, my experience was from reading so much and talking about exhibitions and your work in Mexico City. And you've now been here for the last few years, and it's a great opportunity to work with you. I think I don't know about everyone, and I can't wait. I mean, it's hard to speak before you too, and really just briefly want to reminisce for a quick second. My first real job was at Dia Center for the Arts, and I think it also being a space for dialogue, a space that is catalyzed by artists and by artworks. And that opportunity, and this is the early 90s, I got to know Jeff Wall's work through probably his criticism more so than his artwork. But I think if you even take a quick glance in the gallery, and certainly we will be entertained and educated this evening, you can see very easily, looking at the work, thinking about the work, how much it is in touch with histories around contemporary art and even beyond that. I mean, histories of art in general. For me, my entry point, I guess, was a piece on Ankawara from 1993, and in which the discussion centered around history as it was represented vis-a-vis Ankawara's paintings, which of course are known as date paintings. And then to think about the writings on Andy Warhol, and a real contribution there that goes, I think, above and beyond what so many artists are doing today. So it is an honor to be able to introduce the two of you. And I just also have to point out that the exhibition is on view from October 22 to January 17, and reflects our ongoing commitment to supporting the work of living artists, as well as bringing the best contemporary art to the South Florida community. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome now Tobias Ostrander and Jeff Wall. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here with Jeff Wall. Jeff and I had the opportunity to work on a larger exhibition in Mexico City in 2008, I believe, and we've kept in touch. And when I was coming to Miami, coming to the Pérez Art Museum, he generously, said we should do something sometime together. And so we've been talking back and forth about that for a while. And I have been following Jeff's work for a long time, and kind of deeply involved in the thinking behind it. It sort of stays with me. His images stay with me so strongly, and I think kind of living in Miami and sort of looking around the streets of Miami, many of his images come back to me, and I was particularly thinking about a certain tendency in his work, or a certain subject matter related to people living in the streets, or kind of actions in the streets, often disenfranchised, or people living on the fringes of society, and images taken in the street sort of have always been within his practice, and it very much resonated to sort of images I see every day, sort of in this neighborhood of people living on the streets right off of Biscayne. And so I thought it might be interesting to ask him to present a piece or several pieces related to that. And my initial idea, I had always had this sort of vision of doing just a show with one work of yours, Jeff. And so just like one gallery, one work. Kind of like the way people would go in the 19th century to see one huge, painting, by a new painting by an artist. But so I sort of came to Jeff with that proposal, sort of, thinking about the subject matter within his work, but also, I sent him the floor plans of this small gallery, this project gallery in the museum. And a little while later, he sent me back the proposal that we see downstairs, which are three images. One is called Approach, and this is a very recent image from 2014. Another image called Intersection from 2008. These are both sort of very, large scale or medium scale, medium for Jeff. And Searcher, which is a very small image. So maybe as a way to just begin, Jeff, why these three? Why these three images?
Well, Tobias, you asked me if I would do something along the lines of the subject you proposed. So, because as you say, I have done a number of pictures on this kind of subject, and because I had coincidentally either had just finished or was about to finish the one that's on the screen right now, which was made last spring, it's spring 14, it seemed feasible to do it. And it was a way of presenting a new picture rather than something that had been seen before. But your gallery was a little bit too big for one picture, I thought. And maybe, although my whole emphasis is on the singularity of pictures, that they are singular entities, that mine at least don't necessarily imply another picture, despite the fact that I am interested in the singularity of them, it seemed like I had other things to say. So it struck me also that it might be interesting to treat a gray picture, an essentially gray monochrome, as a color, and to combine it with color to create an ensemble in a room that would have its own coloristic element. You know, no matter how current an image is or how pressing the material, the subject matter seems to be, an art museum is a place to look at artworks which are supposed to be beautiful. And I always think back to a line from Baudelaire's art criticism from 150 years ago, when she said, no matter what a work of art is, it's also like a bouquet of flowers. It has to be somehow beautiful in terms of color, shape, form, and so on. But exhibitions, I think, are the same. They also have to have an aesthetic side to them. They have to be nice to look at. They have to have that aspect. And of course, it delves into the subject, I think, a little bit more than it would be on its own.
And tell a little bit more about the what you see going on between these three images, how they dialogue. Were you talking in terms of color? Is that, you know?
Photography is very complex art. It's more complex, I think, than people have realized, even over its history. Maybe only now, at the point where it's technologically being transformed, do we get a sense of the intricate interior domain of practices that make up photography. So if I make an exhibition, I like to try and bring together photographs that are made different ways, so that one can see, or at least sense, that these are not all the same. So I picked 3 pictures, all of which were made differently. You know, people have the idea about my work that everything is planned out in advance, like totally planned out in advance. And then not only is it planned out in advance, it's executed exactly according to plan. You know, that's the cliche that goes around, but that's, of course, so far from the truth that exhibitions can also be a way of kind of demonstrating that aspect. It may or may not be completely evident, but I'll say, and I'm certainly not going to tell you everything about how I make my pictures, and I'll tell you why if you want to ask me that, but I'm not telling everything about how I make them. But the approach was made with the collaboration of the person you see in it. Intersection is a street photograph. It was made without any knowledge on the part of those 2 guys that they were being photographed. And Searcher is a photograph I made with my cell phone out of my car window. So each of them is made in a different way. I'd say the 2 color pictures are essentially documentary photographs. There's nothing in them that's any different than you'd find in the Cartier-Bresson or anything else, any other photograph of that type. And I like to bring those things together with pictures made differently. It would be interesting to have a picture that was maybe a montage of 20, 50, or 100 negatives, along with something that was made, let's say, in 2 seconds. Both are photography equally at every moment. And it's that difference that really interests me in making exhibitions.
There was I presented the show to our docents yesterday, and there was a lot of, and I was describing your practice and the various ways that you work, and there was some reaction, sort of a little bit of maybe confusion about sort of the kind of possible stagings or restagings of things, but there was a general question about your relationship, or the subject-object kind of relationship here, and do you, in the cases where it's perhaps a found image, do you have any interaction with the people that you're photographing, or do you think about what it means? Is there some sort of, you know, potential exploitative relationship or something, or how do you think about that?
You mean I'm being exploited somehow?
You or them. I mean, I hadn't thought of that actually in these cases, but I wonder if it goes through your mind.
A lot of times, I see something in the street or somewhere, and I don't photograph. And I've said many times that my work, in a way, begins by not photographing something. And I don't want to be perverse about it, and I don't think it's perverse to say it. To not photograph, to me, is a photographic act. It has in it an aesthetic aspect, and it has in it possibly an ethic as well. But I wouldn't claim that ethic to apply to anyone else but me. But because it applies, or I apply it to myself, it can be considered a model to contemplate if you feel like contemplating it. You know, in art there are no rules and no obligations. Art only matters to the people who feel it matters to them. Art is only beautiful to people who feel beauty. Art only goes into your life if you want it to. It's all voluntary. So no claim made by any artist is binding on anyone else, only on that person. But I like something about the fact that the aspects of reality escape me as a photographer, and that my photography is based on that escape, at least to a certain extent. If I see something and don't photograph it, I feel like I have encountered it like anyone else. And it enters my memory, and then I kind of work with in a way, work with the shadow that's cast by its disappearance and rebuild it according to elements that I can't really explain clearly or briefly. Feelings I have about it, memories that connect to it, other stories that connect to it, colors that are associated with it, place that's associated with it, and so on. But because art is a plastic thing, a place can be changed for another place for whatever reason. I feel free in that relationship. So reconstruction is a very subjective thing. That brings me into a different relation with a person I'd photographed than if I hadn't. And those relationships are very different one from the other. I'll come back to that if you want me to. But to try and answer the question about whether there's what the relationship between the person who's being photographed and the photographer is, let's talk about the poor, to make a very simple category. A poor. I won't try and define them because we probably know what they are, who they are, and why they're like that, or at least we have ideas why there are poor. Why isn't everybody not poor? I make no claim to be even interested in poor people or the poor. That subject has been in art since centuries. It's one of the most conventional, interesting, and even highly respected subjects for pictorial art, and it's been around for hundreds of years. To become interested in that subject really suggests nothing very direct about the attitude of the artist. He may be like I feel I am, someone very conventional, just following a long tradition of doing something that is artistically interesting, and in being artistically interesting, has a chance to be socially interesting for those who find it socially interesting. So my relationship with the people I photograph is an artistic relationship. They are my subjects, the subjects of my work, just the way another person or another object or an animal or a landscape or a sky would be. And there's a certain distance that one has to take to that. And I think that is inherent in the process of picture making. Now, I don't know what it really means. I don't know whether that's an answer, but it's a situation that exists and that can't be escaped from. So to try and define it in terms of a public ethic is difficult, because we aren't directly in an ethical relationship to a subject picture. We're in an aesthetic relationship to the subject, which means it can be contemplated for its artistic qualities. And if it's enjoyed artistically, some aspect of the subject is conveyed, is expressed, is felt. I think if you have feelings, personal feelings, you take them away from the art. And the artwork, by allowing you or giving you enjoyment, maybe creates a situation in which that experience can mean something to you. I don't think the meanings of pictures are of any interest to anyone who hasn't enjoyed that picture, artistically enjoyed it.
Let's talk a little bit about let's move away from these three a little bit and just, I'm sort of have some examples of this subject matter in different ways, but I was sort of interested in thinking back at other examples of individuals or the poor, as you say, sort of in the streets, and how, but also the relationship of these subjects to urban space, because that's a more general interest of yours. This image in particular, I think, is one of the ones that haunts me a lot as I look out. Actually, the view here at the museum, it's called Overpass, and it sort of always reminds me of sort of the bridge outside the window, and it's a very enigmatic image, because I remember first I had seen it and seen it many times before I started to really see it and to really look more carefully at who these people, what they were carrying, sort of the luggage, the worn luggage, and then you start realizing that these people may, live in the street, or they are not on their way to the airport necessarily, or as first image. But I wonder, can you talk a little bit about like how the street plays into this subject matter for you?
At that time, this was 15 years ago I made this picture, and at that time I first noticed people who were transient, rolling little carry-on luggage things. I hadn't seen that before. It seemed practical if you had to carry your stuff around all the time, you could roll it instead of have to carry it. And because that piece of luggage is in the picture, a lot of unobservant art critics thought they were people going to the airport. And I suppose they might be going to the airport. I saw a subject almost very similar to this one day, very near to my studio, and it struck me that the presence of transient people who necessarily have no fixed address, who constantly move in the city. It was another instance of this subject that has always fascinated me. And I can't really tell you why it fascinates me. I obviously have some personal reaction to it. I don't think of myself as a transient or a vagabond or anything romantic like that, but I obviously connect to them in some way, and I can't explain it and have long ago kind of stopped trying. But I liked what also moved me about it was the sense that this is a little family of people who aren't related to each other, who form some kind of even temporary group amongst themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's a survival element, maybe just for companionship. You can't know about their relationships, of course. Where I saw them was not where you see the picture, and this is what I go back to what I mentioned before. Reportage photography, which captures an event as it happens, seizes it at the moment it's really witnessed. And that's obviously an important part of photography, central. It has a certain unfreedom in it that's always bothered me a little bit. In other words, if you see a person jumping off a plank and trying to get over a puddle in an empty yard in Paris, and you capture him just before his heel hits the water, you've got that famous photograph by Cartier-Bresson. Mm-hmm. But that's all you've got. Mm-hmm. It has to be in that place, it has to be that puddle, it has to be that day, it has to be that hat, it has to be that coat. Mm-hmm. That's great, that's what photography is, but it bothers me because I might think that another place, another day, another light, another time of day, another puddle might be equally fascinating. And so in not photographing it, it means that it can be any hat, any coat, any puddle, any board. Mm-hmm. And that's a kind of plastic freedom that I like. I feel that is contra the immediacy of reportage. It's opposite to the immediacy of reportage. It's not better, it's not artistically superior, it's just different. And the difference is the plasticity of picture making that is permitted. And that's just something I've always liked. So this is how I practice it, not because it's a better kind of photography, but because I like it. It works for me as a person. So when I thought about the people, I wanted to change the place. Often I do that, I go and look until I find something that seems apropos, and it has a color, it has a light, it has shapes, etc. And then I try and make some sort of reconstruction. Of course, chance is going to come in a lot in this case, and when I first started working on this picture, I thought I would get a nice blue sky with puffy white clouds in it. And that was kind of interesting because puffy white clouds in a blue sky are ultimately banal and annoying, and I thought that might be an interesting thing to try for once. The reason I do that is because I believe there's no such thing as good light for photography. I think of the most perfect example of good light for photography is Barrett and Hillebesher, who only photographed on gray overcast days because their photography needed that specific light. That was their good light. I totally respect that, but I like the idea that there's no good light. That it's all possible. And in this case, I didn't get that sky. I got this spring stormy sky, which is pretty beautiful and accidental, and it was again entirely an accident. I should also just say that, except for the things that I do control in my pictures, everything else in them is accidental.
Can you talk a little bit about, maybe we'll jump around a little bit. I just had a few examples of sort of kind of street imagery. Can you talk a little bit about, you use the term cinematographic, cinematic?
Cinematography?
Yes, cinematography.
Yeah, I use the term for what I do.
And can you unpack that term? Why that term?
In the 19th century, you had photographers who posed people, and they invented stuff, and they did montage, all the things that I do. And once in a while, some critic will say, you know, his work looks like Fred Hollanday's montages from 1899. And those are very elaborately done, but very tastelessly bad imitations of Victorian painting. The history of photography is based, has in it this episode in its fairly early days when some photographers imitate painting of their time. The only problem was they imitated the wrong painting of their time because, well, I don't really know why they did it. I was going to say because they generally didn't have enough understanding about painting at the time. It's also interesting to know that at the very moment those guys were imitating really tired out Victorian genre painting, people like Degas were taking snapshots with Kodak Brownie cameras. So they were really barking up the wrong tree of photography at that moment. But the methods that they used are perfectly legitimate. So when I began to become dissatisfied with reportage photography in the 70s, it struck me that these methods could be released somehow back into photography, but not the way they were done in the 19th century, because that was clearly a dead end in the world of photography, and the world of art had pretty much closed the door on that idea already by 1900. But it was really the influence of the films I saw as a young person in the 1960s and 70s when the new cinema, a sort of new generation of filmmakers who now are in the canon, like Godard or Antonioni, were being shown for the first time. And like a lot of people my age, I saw Antonioni's films or Godard's films, not in cinematheques or film clubs, but in the cinemas on the commercial cinemas. They were being played as films like any other, which was a very fortunate moment to be interested in film. And what I learned from that was that photographers who made those films were as good as the photographers in the photographic canon. So cinematography, take an example, simple example, Ingmar Bergman's work with Sven Nykvist. He made films like Persona or Winter Light, and so on. Those films are photographed as beautifully as Arbus or Frank or Strand could have done. And it made me realize that cinematography is a kind of photography. I mean, not to mention the fact that films are all made of still photographs. So the cinema is just an odd way of looking at photographs, really, when persistence of motion makes them seem like they can move. In any case, the example of cinematography reopened the notion that one could collaborate in making photographs with people, call them performers, that one could decorate, one could choose places specifically for their evocation of some meaning or feeling, etc., and not be bound by the unity and the immediacy of the documentary or reportage type of photography. It opened up the possibility that could be done in a new way without any relationship to the imitation of painting, for example, although it, for me, brought back the possibility of a new relationship with what I loved in painting without imitating it. So my relation with painting and any photographer's relation with painting, I suppose, today is in a way is mediated by actual cinematography, that is the photography done by people who are making films. I just thought you could detach the process of cinematography from the cinema. So I don't use the term cinematic for what I do because it's not cinema. It's a kind of photography that shares with cinematography a couple of aspects. Preparation before one photographs, and collaboration with others in the process. Everything else in it is circumstantial to the subject at hand. So I began doing that in the early 80s. And in the case of Mimic, which you've got on the screen here, try to use that method to, in a way, imitate and contemplate street photography. So Mimic was a kind of imitation of street photography by other means. It captured something I had seen, but couldn't photograph, but wanted to bring into view, to bring it into, create an appearance, make it visible.
Yeah, I think what's so important, and I think I assume you've always spoken about it, but I think it's more on your mind, or the way that your work goes between sort of what you call documentary photography and cinematographic or photographs, and continues to blur the two. Or you're very interested in what is a constructed image, what is a found image, and particularly like the filmmakers you're describing, they were very much involved with sort of actors, the line between what is real or documentary, and what is fictional was always being sort of tested and pushed into. I mean, I see a methodology in those filmmakers that you're using as a photographer, beyond just the image itself, but the process of making the photograph.
I think it was very important in the 1940s and 50s when filmmakers like De Sica in Italy, Fellini to a certain extent, made films about real situations using amateur, non-professional performers playing themselves, but playing themselves inside a scenario that could make up what we call a movie. And they called it neorealism. And it was a kind of new realism, I guess that's what they meant. A realism which escaped some parts of the studio system of filmmaking, certainly the Hollywood system, which is driven by the star, and the emphasis on the personage that one sees in film, not having the double identity of it being a movie star and the character they're playing. As beautiful as that is, it can become irritating that you're watching a film and you're suspending disbelief and everything in the film seems real, the places are real, the light is real, the action seems believable, but there's someone famous pretending not to be famous. That can be distracting, and those filmmakers dealt with that very, very internal problem of the cinema. It's essentially an internal problem of the cinema, which is how do you make famous people appear to be not famous anymore? And then deal with that issue. It goes also to the theater, the star. They want to eliminate that and bury the person in the part. And neorealism was a kind of important methodology to rethink the cinema. And it, of course, brought it close to to the documentary, and there's, of course, in filmmaking, there's documentary filmmaking, and they learned a lot from that and did documentary films. What it opened up was the idea that there is no fixed boundary between reportage and cinematography, between reportage and some form of collaboration. This is one of the reasons I don't like the term staged photography. Staged photography suggests a stage. Stage suggests stagehands, sets, ropes that pull them up and down or whatever in the old stage, certain kinds of lights, an audience in a certain place, a script that's rehearsed in a certain way, and so on and so on. But really, collaboration in photography can be something as simple as standing in the street with a camera, photographing people who don't know they're being photographed, which, by the way, is more and more easy these days because nobody knows what a camera looks like anymore. So that if you're standing in the street with a camera, nobody knows what it is. Photographing people without them noticing it, or raising your hand, catching the attention of a person who's passing by and having them react to your gesture, you've already got a collaboration happening. So to use kind of this Duchampian term, the infra-thin, the line between collaboration and not collaboration is infra-thin. It can be transformed instantly and very simply. So working with people is a scale of activity. It's not a thing. There's no one method. And I think neorealist film was really valuable in elaborating ways that could happen. And elaborating it in ways that photographers weren't ready to engage, because the aesthetics of documentary photography as art were pretty stringent up until the 70s or 80s, and it wasn't really very acceptable to do other things that was considered commercial. In the cinema, photography in the cinema was more evolved than photography in photography in that sense. It opened doors that photographers themselves weren't ready to entertain. It's interesting to think about it in the reverse, to realize that when Cartier-Bresson would go out in the morning to photograph, let's say, some subject, that subject was a scenario. He already had a scenario in order to make this picture. He was already operating in a structure that was not as different from what I'm calling cinematography as the reporters have insisted on. What's interesting in that way of thinking about it is that the categories of, the aesthetic categories of photography were rather static.
Just run through a couple. These are just examples. I was thinking of street images, but let me run an image like this, or when you talk about, or you often, or an image like this. Let's stay with this one, but
Flooded grave.
Yeah, flooded grave. When you talk about sort of the frustration with sort of, or that your work often gets talked about as staged photography. I think you're one of the most visible of a particular generation that really did create quite complex constructions, physical constructions, and I think you, over time, one sees the range of kind of the cadences of that, sort of the intensity of something that is obviously constructed, and something that you don't know if it's constructed or not. But tell me a little bit about sort of this image, or what was sort of behind it, because it's obviously something that's very hard, or very enigmatic, whether this was something found in life, but we assume hasn't been found in life.
This image was on the cover of Art Forum 10, 15 years ago in relation to an article in which I let them ask me about how the picture was made and told them all the details.
Oh, really?
Something I never do anymore. The reason I don't do it, and the reason I kind of regret having done that article, is because it created too much, it generated too much attention on the making, on the how of picture making, of my picture making at least. I know that everybody who's interested in art is essentially interested in the how, and that's fine. But I began to feel that that aspect was becoming a distraction. I make pictures so that they're complete, so that I make pictures in order to complete them. And in the completion of the work, the process vanishes. I'm not a process-oriented artist in that sense. I don't really want a process to show, or at least to show in any very salient or let's say distracting way. It's much more enjoyable for a viewer to come upon a picture like The Flooded Grave, or any picture for that matter, and just enjoy it, which means to experience it, to see how an image fails to narrate, how it suggests an event or an occurrence which could be narrated but fails to account for that. And in the process of allowing you to enjoy the picture, sets off a desire for you to narrate it. Because I believe that in the moment of enjoyment of a picture, we write the narrative. Pictures can't do that. I'm only interested in that experiential aspect of art on the part of the spectator. Now, don't take this the wrong way, but it's not possible to get behind the scenes of the making of artworks if you're not there. It simply isn't possible. In the media today, now because art is so popular, everybody, and because art has become sort of part of the media, and one of the most popular things in the media is to be behind the scenes. The entire tabloid media, reality TV, it's all about being behind the scenes. Everybody wants to be behind the scenes. But now being behind the scenes is just a slightly shifted position in front of the scene. It's an illusion. One can't be behind the scenes of the making of artworks unless you're making them. So to explain how an artwork is made is pointless. It can't be really understood. And moreover, like a lot of artists, I have my secrets that cost me a lot of time, money, and sweat to create, and I'm not going to give them away for nothing. So I have my ways of making my work. It's pretty obvious that things are made. Things are made in order to be photographed. Now with the computers, images that were shot at different times can be put together in certain ways. They can be put together either in a way that it's obvious or it's impossible to fathom. All those things are taking place in that picture. I'll say that it's made out of many negatives. It's a photo montage. And it was ignited by a simple daydreamy kind of fantasy, which was taking a walk in a cemetery and seeing a hole filling with water, and sort of somehow associating that with an undersea experience. Kind of pointless, musing, nothing really very interesting, but it interested me enough to set off the possibility of doing something very difficult and bring to life this underwater moment, as if one were standing there and it flickered into your mind for a millisecond as a sudden association. You know, this happens to us all the time. We associate things. We don't actually see them, but we intuit them. So with a photograph, with this picture, I thought I could stabilize that. Because photographs are instantaneous, you can imagine, if you like, that this vision that you're having here lasted only the 1,000th of a second the shutter was open. So it is really a microsecond, it could be a microsecond in your mind. So a lot of things were done to accomplish it, a lot of sleight of hand, shall we say, and a lot of technical elements, which interest me because I like technical challenges. I like things that are difficult. And in doing those difficult things, you also learn a lot about photography. I'll just say one last thing about this picture. It's made up of 100 negatives. Each one of them is a documentary photograph. So pictures of the graveyard are just as they were. Someone dug out that pile of dirt. The undersea life that is in the picture was all photographed under certain specific conditions, but they're just shots of what happened in that tank. So it's a montage really of documentary shots.
So that play between those two.
I think it's impossible to avoid that play. One can go to the pole of reportage and avoid it on that score. one could probably find some total artificial pole on the other side to avoid it on the other side, although I don't know what that place would be. But really the interior of photography, if you think of it as a field, spatialize it, is the nuance and the energy flows between these two possibilities. They never stabilize, at least not as far as I'm concerned.
Do you think of, you've written on, let me just move a little bit. Do you think about, you've written a lot, I mean, some incredible texts about the photography and conceptual photography, and, but I wonder, your investigation of the medium or the potential of the medium itself, do you see that as sort of kind of a continuing sort of a modernist kind of looking for the essences of the medium in some way, or do you see that as evolving or continually expanding? You know, I mean,
I really do see it as a modernist idea, that one, to work in a medium or an art form, I mean, painting is an art form or is it a medium? Difficult to say, but let's blur that for a moment.
mm-hmm.
To work inside of an art form or a medium is to have to deal with conditions of that medium.
Right.
That's almost a truism. At one time it seemed like one could define the essence of the medium.
Mm-hmm.
That was the Greenbergian moment, which was extremely important, and it was the moment in which I really first began to get serious about art. Greenberg thought he could define the essence of the medium, and he did a pretty good job of it, at least for his time. Michael Fried nuanced it by saying the medium is what it is at this moment in its history, and that's surprising, because the next moment something will happen to suggest that the problems of the medium are unanticipated ones. I think that's still rather good, to sense that the medium is what it is, but it's somewhat indefinable. So in a sense you have to intuit it, or feel it, or at least have practiced it to get a sense of how, what its nature is at that moment or what its demands are. Photography is particularly complicated because there really it has so many applications, there's so many techniques. It's in a way more complicated than painting, which is paint, an applicator, and a surface. Photography, you have a machine, another machine that processes films, you have chemistry, etc. It's actually a little more complicated technically than, say, painting or drawing. It's not more complicated artistically, more technically complicated technically. So, like all the arts, there are no rules. So the paradoxical thing about any kind of modernist feeling for the medium is that it has the gesture you make to solve, let's say, the problem of the medium is done without rules. It's done only through intuition of the artist, experimentation, failure, and finally, and this is where Greenberg was entirely right, on judgment of the results.
Do you see the technical changes within photography as part of that dialogue, or is it the more the kind of conceptual frame of photography doesn't change that much, the medium is the medium defined differently as the technology continues to change?
Probably
in the sense of the larger sense of medium.
It's kind of hard to say, but also, at one time probably painting was used for practical purposes like making signs or directions. Handmade images were practical, had some practical application. Now they don't really have it. And painting is now sort of, as an art form, kind of cut off from practical applications, whereas photography is being applied practically every day in some way for science, for news, for whatever it happens to be. Photography is still full of its own practical applications, which means surprises are going to happen in invention to do with practical application. So, whatever it might happen to be, digital photography, new forms of montage, new looks of photography that emerge from situations of photography. photography as a medium is going to be disturbed by those external elements in the way that, say, sculpture or painting probably isn't so much, because they do not have practical applications today in any way like the way they've had in the past. So the technological element going to play a part. But you know, those technological things are muted by the by artistic demand. For example, if I say that the photographing a poor is traditional, time-bound, and in a way conventional, that would remain the case no matter what technical means is applied to that subject. It could be digital, it could be something else, it could even be a moving image, but it's still underneath the criteria, the artistic criteria of how we depict that subject, which is not, of course, one way, but there's a canon even of treatment of it that goes back.
Do you, I think, or I feel looking at sort of the trajectory of your work, I feel earlier on there might have been more references to historical paintings, and I wonder if you feel that diminished, or do you feel that there are more more references now to the history of photography specifically? Do you see that a tendency in your work, or not necessarily?
I never made any references to historical paintings.
Oh, okay.
Or if I made them, they were completely overt. Like, for
Right.
example, if I did The Thinker, it was related directly to Dürer's sculpture.
Right.
If I did The Sudden Gust of Wind, it was specifically
Right.
in relation to the Hokusai print.
That's what I mean.
If I did Picture of Women, it was specifically related to Manet's painting. But I never had any interest in some generic similarity of my work to some generic notion of 19th century painting, another cliche that's circulated about my work. I know you're not asking me that. Another aspect, an important aspect of the cinematic graphic for me is another aspect of the freedom. If you're doing reportage, and this is no criticism of reportage, you have to go out and report. That's what you do. You have to get up in the morning, get your equipment together, figure out where you're going to go, and go report. And that's your starting point every day. I'm not suited for that. What I like about the method I'm working in is that I can start anywhere. I can start my work by not getting up in the morning, just daydreaming and musing until something enters in my head as a starting point. Or I can be reading a book, or as I said, I could be glancing out my window and not photographing. The freedom of being able to do that is, to me, one of the essences of what the reason it appeals to me. So, you know, I've done pictures that have been started off by something I read. I've done 2 or 3 of them. I may do more. If I feel like reporting, I report. If I don't feel like reporting, I don't report. I think the model of the film maker, or even the film company, who can say, well, we made a musical, now let's make a Western, you know, now we'll make a fantasy film, now we'll do this, we'll do that, and we can do it in different styles, is an interesting model. It means that there are multiple starting points, multiple points of access to what you yourself are interested in, or don't yet know you're interested in. And if you're not obliged to practice your art in a certain way, then you're not obliged to pay attention to the same type of subject matter. And you can pay attention to different subject matter, or different moods that you might be in, or different possibilities. I like that.
You described, I love this interview recently that you did with the Louisiana Museum about you would like people to think, to look at pictures as they might read a poem. Could you talk about that metaphor? I mean, I think it's very useful in terms of how you approach thinking about people looking at your image.
I think people do look at pictures the way they read poems. I think they look at films the way they read poems. I think they read poems the way they look at sculptures. I think that aesthetic experience is more or less the same thing, no matter what the art form is. Going to a concert of music is not so different from reading a novel if you're looking for an aesthetic experience. I've noticed that, everyone's noticed that there's a very intricate relationship, at least in Western art, and it's probably not only in Western art, between literature or the spoken or written word and the visual. Some people say that literature is really the most total art form that we have because it's in language that the person is revealed most, that because we are so much dependent on language, that language is so much us, that literature can never, or poetry can never be a minor art because language is the center of our existence. And I think, one time in the 19th century, people thought music was the essential art, in the Wagnerian sense. That may be true too, but it's interesting to think that literature may be the central art of any culture because of its linguistic base and its ability to suggest, to describe, to report, to do all these things. And if you think that, then you might think that visual art is really about, it's kind of minor, because all it can really do is astonish you by seeing the world fresh from another pair of eyes, by the skill of the artist who shows you something dazzling, by great composition, etc. But really, that's just kind of partial compared to the totality of hearing a person talk for a long time, like reading War and Peace. You hear this author speak for a long, long time. It tells you so many things, and so many images are summed up, and the consequences of action are told, and they're analyzed, and so on. That it seems that there's a certain poverty of the visual, which means that in a way that the visual is dependent on literature in a drastic way. And I've always felt that. Not that I don't believe that visual art is inferior to literature, but I think it depends on it in a very, very intricate and radical sense. The problem is that images cannot be literary directly. They are mute. They cannot narrate. They, if anything, erase narration. They arrest it. They congeal it into an image, and they can't actually release it. So a pictorial art, has this very tense, very long, very intricate relation, not just with poetry, but with all literary existence. But to make it a little smaller, photography resembles literature sometimes very strikingly. And when I think about poetry, I think mostly about prose poetry. And the greatest prose poems in my mind are still those written by Baudelaire. And he wrote them at the time when newspapers were flourishing like they'd never before, and journalism was a social practice that had become more important than it had ever been. And he imitated a journalist writing a prose account of some ordinary event that could have been a minor news event. Like, for example, a poor family standing outside an expensive restaurant looking in the window at the diners inside. You could imagine a human interest story in a newspaper about that. He could start to write a little human interest report, and because of who he was, it ended in a poem. Photographs are like that. The reportage can be transformed in the process of being made.
You talked about sort of the limits of people tend to not read them, or there's a difficulty in reading them because we expect to recognize them or as evidence of a specific moment. It's harder to see the potential abstraction of the narrative necessarily right away.
I think it's hard because photography has its identity as reportage. This identity can never be disturbed because it's true to what photography is. There's never been a machine that could report and report on the appearances of things and the happenings like the camera. It simply never existed before, and it's identified with this capacity. it's correctly identified with this capacity. I would never argue that the capturing the immediate appearance of things is not the central purpose of photography. And I think in the 80s, when photography began to branch out the way we've been talking about, people sort of thought, well, we're challenging, you know, photographers in my generation are challenging this truth. I don't think that ever really happened. We can't challenge it. It's unchallengeable. All we can do is look into the shadows thrown by the monument that that truth is and see what photography looks like on the shaded side. So if it turns out that there are other dimensions inside the practice of the medium, other dimensions inside the way that one operates inside of photography, those can be artistically interesting, I hope, artistically legitimate, but they'll never displace this central aspect of photography. The idea of trying to displace it's never been interesting to me. But I like the idea that if you see a picture like this Citizen, which easily could be a documentary photograph and is very close to being one, I like the sense that to some extent there may be something in it that suggests that what you're seeing never happened. Because Hamlet never happened. When you go to the theater and see many plays, the events they're depicting never occurred as such in real life. And to a great extent, one of the most fascinating things in art is the witnessing of events that never took place. It's a bit like the essential time travel that an artwork can be. Is it now, is it then? So I've used the term occultation of photography, making it more occult. That is, withdrawing it from its reportage functions, but subtly, even invisibly, such that you may not be able to see the withdrawal of the reportage function, but it may be sensed, maybe in the style, maybe in the contradictions of the technique, maybe in the scale. Who knows exactly what you'd have to analyze it in any individual picture. One of the problems of photography that I think is disturbing to me, and it was valorized very strongly by Roland Barthes, was that photography is essentially tells us this has been. It casts it essentially into the past, and that photographs are records of the past. That to me always seemed deeply limiting for art, because when I look at a painting, no matter when it was made, it's not the past. I know it's old, but it exists in the present. I think it's the same with sculpture
or novel,
or the theater. Hamlet occurs again when it's played again. It's immediate and it's in the now. I've always disliked this idea that photography is uniquely placed only to send us into the past. Nothing's more beautiful than the experience of the nowness of art when you're experiencing it. You know, you go to see a painting that's 300 years old, but it's happening to you now and it has a nowness. It doesn't matter that the costumes that people are wearing are from another time. You know, it really doesn't matter. Photography has to struggle for that. And that may be one of the struggles that photography is now undertaking, is to find its own eternal present, which is a kind of, you know, Stendhal called it promise of happiness. This thing that we get from art that makes us feel better. It's uplifting. No matter how depressing the subject might be, it uplifts you. Is that somehow the now has recurred to you, it's reavailable, it's become available to you again. I think photography has a particularly hard struggle in that, and I'm very interested in that.
Do you have any, or maybe we'll open it up to questions in a few minutes, but do you have anything you want to say about this brand new image? Anything more you want to?
I just had a show open on Tuesday in New York of this picture and some other new ones. And in all gallery shows, they want to make a press release, you know? They have everyone sees these press releases from galleries. And they sometimes are a couple pages long of interpretive material about the work that you're going to see in the show. And I've always kind of resisted that, but this time I had no information of any kind on the press release. I don't think it's necessary to know where the picture was made. I don't think it's necessary to know how the picture was made. I don't think it's necessary to know any of those things for the reasons I mentioned before. You can't get behind the scenes anyway, so forget it. Just enjoy the picture, and what's the factual material in that picture, if it's a good work, will come off the surface to you, and you will know it. You will learn it, you will recognize it, you will understand it. It's not mysterious in that sense. So I don't want to say anything about it that would be any act of interpretive description or anything like that. So no, I don't want to say that about it.
But like all of your images, the more time you spend with them, the more mysterious they actually become. And I think this is a great example of that. You know, the things that we think we see get more and more complex as we spend time with the image. I think that's
Well,
particularly.
I hope it's true, because if it is, it means, you see, that element of complexity to me is only carried by enjoyment. Enjoyment is something that you experience in front of works of art. Everyone who loves art knows what I'm talking about. It doesn't have to be defined. You know the feeling. It's important, and that enjoyment sends signals, sends information to you in some experiential, emotional way. As I said, I'm trying to, in a way, occult my photography, make it unavailable as discourse or commentary, so that, first of all, institutional commentary can be silenced, because I think probably it's time for that. That the artist's voice should be silenced, because the artist is no authority once the picture is done, the work is done. I think my interpretation of my work is colored by the fact that I know a lot of things about it that are irrelevant by now. Everything I know about how I made my work becomes completely irrelevant once it's finished. And therefore, to repeat those things is to, in a way, in a false way, repeat the making verbally. And so I don't think that is any way does anything anymore. What's fascinating to an artist is the reaction of others, which can be, as I said, if you like the work, you write the poem that is the subject instantaneously somehow in your mind, whether you've written it or not. It's a metaphor that you write that narrative. People who are more curious might even write something down. People like you. People who write about art then actually write these stories, and it becomes commentary. That to me is the completion, or at least the extension of the work.
Are you open for a few questions?
I'm open if they are, yes.
We can, let's bring up the lights a little bit so we can see. There are microphones that, for the recording, it's good to have a microphone. There's one down by the front here. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, I thought it was an interesting way of ending the talk and opening up the Q&A by saying that you don't feel it's relevant for the artist to talk about their work. And that you ended on this particular piece, but in the spirit of that contradiction, I'm going to go ahead and ask about this particular piece. Because I noticed from the presentation you have here, this particular piece has, the lighting is completely different from all the other pieces, and I wanted to ask you about that. I know that was to an extent was a conscious decision, but I'm not curious about the technical reasons for it because it's pretty obvious, but I was more interested in the decision to have it lit so badly, technically. But I mean, I know it had to do more with what we were trying to convey with the image. I was just more curious to know what that was, since you're here,
About the lighting, you mean?
Yes.
Well, this is a real place, and it's lighted in a real way. It's lit how it's lit. Just as I said, all lighting there is no bad lighting. I have to say that. There's no bad lighting, there's just lighting. This room is lit in a certain way. It's very specific to this room. It's caused by the equipment that's in this room. All places are lighted. And this place, which is the underneath of a freeway, is lighted by a certain kind of lighting, certain kind of equipment. And it looks like that. I lit it like that. Did I light it? It lit itself. It was lit. It was lit. It became lit. Lighting occurred in that place. That is the light of the place. The mood of the picture, of course, and the mood of every picture is almost at first level determined by the illumination, whether it's in a painting or in drawing or in a photograph. The illumination is the key to visibility, first of all. There's no light, there's no visibility. So I wanted the light of that place because those things, those occurrences, or that occurrence, occur in that place. So there's a certain unity that, a narrative unity, to contradict myself, and an artistic unity, which is, let me just back up one step. The camera neither knows nor cares if it's recording an occurrence or the absence of an occurrence. And you have to, as a photographer, be like the camera and actually not particularly care whether you're in the presence or the absence of an occurrence, just as you probably have to stop caring in your work whether you're in the presence or the absence of a person, whether you are or not. You have to find a way that the occurringness of an occurrence is simply a condition. So I experienced something like this in the way I mentioned, didn't photograph it, came back to it. It had to be in this place because that's where these things happen. Everything then was determined by that. And I think that's a kind of realism. I tried to add nothing. I didn't invent anything. I did report on what I had seen, and I guess what I had felt about what I had seen, what I remembered, and so on. And I think I can also say I'm reporting on my own work. One other way of putting it is that I don't do fiction. What you see happening in my pictures is happening. Just the way what you see in Cartier-Bresson's pictures happening is happening. They're just not happening in quite the same way. But I am capturing an occurrence in this case. So if I had done any work on the lighting, if I had, it would have only been to make the work I did exactly match what I had encountered. So I'm sorry you think it's bad lighting, but
I like the bad light.
but the world is full of bad lighting, and but the actuality is, as I said, the camera doesn't care what the light is like, so I can't either.
Another question?
Yes, from the street photography aspect of it, do you ever run into problems, or is there ever a problem with using somebody's face in a photo?
What sort of problem?
Well, just using their face. Has somebody ever approached you and say, oh, that's my face of that photo that's been in a show for the last however long?
Well, that would be more the case with the next picture if you want to put it on the screen, because these guys, this is a street photograph, as I said. You know, I shouldn't really even tell you that, because it sort of spoils the whole thing anyway. But let's say it is, okay, let's take a step back and say it probably could be a street photograph. And if it were, then I would have no agreement with those two men. And they might one day see my picture and demand something from me. But you know, they have no right to demand anything from me. You realize under our laws, if one appears in public, in the United States, in any free society that's dominated by a constitution and laws, citizen appearing in public has no right to his own image. People cannot stop you photographing in the street, no matter how much they might like to. They do not own their own image. We do not own our own images. We are not, first of all, we are not property. We are free citizens, and as free citizens, we are no one's property, and we are also not our own property. So therefore, I can photograph in the street anytime I want, so can you, and the person who is photographed has no recourse. So I've never actually been asked, but if I was asked, I'd answer just as I told you. I wouldn't worry about it.
Next question.
Hi, there were some really wonderful ideas in your talk, and that was fantastic, but I wondered if you could maybe talk to the idea of the challenge of creating an image with the eternal presence. Are there any photographers that you feel very strongly achieve that?
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again?
The idea of the eternal presence you mentioned about
Presence
how...
or present?
Present.
Present, sorry, then I wrote it down wrong. Would you be able to talk a bit more about other particular images that you feel achieve that eternal present, or particular photographers, since it's something that's so difficult and challenging to do?
Well, I think that maybe the simplest answer to that is that I think all artistic distinctions reduce back to the question of artistic quality. If the work is good, it has it. If it's not good, it doesn't really have it. That's probably not a very good answer, because inferior works could have it too. But don't you feel that when you're in the presence of something outstanding artistically, that is special? That experience is unique, not like others, and that suddenly the work isn't old anymore? That's what I'm talking about. I think it's a fundamental effect of the quality of a work of art. You know, sometimes it's a little disappointing to read a novel that you read many, many years ago, which you thought was better than you think it is now, and you realize that the language, in fact, seems somehow of the past. And that's disappointing sometimes, to come back in literature to language that seems to have faded into a kind of spirit of the times. It seems it's of its time. But if you read something that doesn't have that, I won't refer to anything, there's so many. That doesn't happen. How is it that certain writers, their language doesn't get old? It doesn't age. And it's the same with certain painters, their images don't do that. I think that is probably really just the outcome of the quality of the art.
Yes, down in the front here.
What about the light boxes that you employed or still employ? Can you comment on that?
I haven't made any light boxes for almost 10 years now. You want to know why I'm not doing them, or just in general?
I'm very curious.
Well, in the 70s, when I first started making my color pictures, there was technical problems that don't exist anymore. And those problems at that time, to be brief, kind of precluded me from making prints on paper. And I was faced with a certain circumstance. It was about 1975, in which I was desperately wanting to start making images, but couldn't find a base for them, like a print base. And that was frustrating. And somebody in the lab I was working in, because in those days everybody who did color photography had to work in a commercial lab, suggested the transparent material, which was being used for advertising, and it was high quality material, which had the benefit of being very permanent, color permanent. So I thought I would try it, and it solved that problem, and it was strikingly, strangely powerful. And at that time, of course, it hadn't been used very much in art, a little bit, but not much. And in the 70s, mid-70s, I think that the idea of making an art new that did not look like art was still a very powerful ethos that came out of minimalism and all that, the idea of the look of non-art. And this kind of satisfied it. And it also, of course, was very much not like the classic photography that John Sarkowski liked and all that sort of thing. So as a young artist, I thought that was pretty cool, and I went with it. Interesting set of problems that emerged from it. So I did it for quite a long time because that was the way to do color photography. In the 90s, and it took me almost 20 years, in the 90s I began to do black and white prints like I've been doing now, since then. And that was the first step I could make away from being stuck in one outcome of photography. Because the light box transparency is one kind of effect. I never really wanted to be stuck with one effect, but it was difficult to get out of it for a while. But once I started making prints, I began to feel I could do many different things, or at least some different things. And of course, the technology began to change very, very quickly about 1990, when digital began to emerge. And so by end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, inkjet printing began to develop to where you can see it now, which is in a very highly developed state. So it just allowed me to kind of, all that sort of allowed me to expand my repertoire of what I could do as a photographer, and find ways to create different effects. If you look at a picture like Approach, it could never be done as a transparency. It's all about darkness and midtones and dark tones. That could never be done in that form. There are things that simply escape certain aspects of photography. The intense color saturation that one got in transparency can't be got in prints. They're much more gentle, they're a little flatter. One can't get certain things, but I don't always want the same thing. So the lightbox is an interesting thing. I'll probably go back to it. I feel it's just part of my repertoire of what I can do.
Just feels more like now. I mean, you're concerned with now.
But I'm not. You mean I'm not concerned with it now?
No, I'm saying you're concerned with the now. It's more available in the light with the light box.
Yeah, I don't see it that way, because I don't think that there is a medium or an effect that is more now than any other. To me, that effect is not now at the moment. It's what I'm not uninterested in it. I'm just interested in other things. So I'll do them, but I just don't feel like doing them right now.
Thank you very much. I think we're gonna stop